You should be making smaller games. That's at least what everyone on YouTube has been saying, including us as the new meta on how to be a game developer. Don't spend your first 5 years working on a single game that then inevitably will most likely end up failing, but instead focus on making smaller scope projects that are a few months long. And then a lot of people, we saw this in the comments as well of the video of where we talked about our earnings, were like, yes, this is awesome, I'm gonna do that, but how do you actually do that? Because it's all good and well to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make a game in 1 month or 3 months or whatever, but it's not that easy because suddenly you have a giant scope and it's like, who's gonna fund this and all of that. So I want to talk a bit more about, hey, how do you actually get started making those smaller games and what are some things that you should keep in mind when doing so? And I think before I dive into the actual how, we need to very quickly cover the why once again. What are some of the advantages of having multiple smaller scoped games instead of working on that 5-year-long RPG game that you want to make? And I think the first and probably one that you'll like to hear as well, and that I'm discovering myself now, is the concept of building multiple games and then having some sort of passive income almost, where you make the game, you spend a few months on it, and then it will keep generating revenue. It may not be as much as the first month after launch, but it will keep making that little bit of money until the end of Steam, basically. And you stack that multiple times, you do 4 games in a year, and you suddenly have 4 passive income streams from your games, and it starts stacking up after a while. And I know you guys always want money, so I think that's a good approach. Another advantage is that you can take more risk, because if you do have a game that completely faceplants after having spent 3 months of development on it and you do the release, it doesn't really matter that much. Of course, it's going to suck, but there's less risk, and if it does fail, well, too bad, better luck next time, but you haven't wasted years of your life. You've just done a few months, short scope, and now you can move on to something else. You'll learn a lot from it. That's an important one as well. Every time you release a game. So I think that's another very good pro, and kind of related to that, because you're only working on something for 3 months, is that idea that, hey, you're not going to get shiny object syndrome, or at least it's going to be much harder, because you can probably work 1 to 3 months on the same project without getting extremely distracted, right? Whereas if you're working on the same large scale project for 2 years, that can become harder, because it's oh, actually, maybe I should throw away all of the code I wrote before and pivot into something else, because survivor likes are the new hotness. Let me get rid of the old mechanics I had, take my game concept, make it a survivor like, and then suddenly it becomes a deck builder and whatever, because you keep chasing the shiny thing. And when you started 2 years ago, that is just dull and old and you don't want to touch that anymore. If you do that smaller scope, you can always basically chase the next shiny object. And it's yeah, I can probably power through for an extra month. If you are oh, I'm getting kind of sick of this project already, you can just power through, ship it, and move on. And then of course you just learn more. I think I already kind of said that, but just going through the entire start to finish process, because making a game is only part of the entire making a game process, basically. You can code the game, but also things like marketing, how does Steam work, all of that basically. There's a lot of learning you can do there as well. And the more games you release, the more you will learn from it. Now you do want to make one of those small scoped games. The question is, how do you keep that scope small? It's probably one of the biggest problems that people always have, because they have 5,000 different ideas and then they certainly need to put it into a 3-month project where realistically you already want to have the game kind of done after 2 months, and then spend a month on marketing the game and doing a little bit of extra content and whatever. But the core should be there. How do you do that? And my advice, and that's what we did for Unicycle Pizza Time, I'm going to use that as my case study, but there's another very good Reddit post that I'll link down below from the developer of Minami Lane, who makes also 6-month long projects, I think is what they do, small scope projects. And I personally suggest focusing on one core game mechanic and then just building around that, but only having that one thing. And it should make it a very easy pitch for your game as well, because you're not explaining oh, it has this and it had this and then all of it is a city builder and you wrap all of that together. But it's hey, you have this one mechanic. Either it's a survivor with a specific hook, or it's the fact that hey, it's a delivery game and you'd ride a unicycle or whatever, that style of stuff. But nail that core and don't focus on reinventing anything else. Just focus on taking what works from other games then and putting it in your game, and keeping your scope small that way. Look at adding one big new feature, one big new hook, but not 17 different game mechanics from 15 different genres. That is not what I would suggest doing. Once again, time-wise, I would plan for 2 months of dev time, especially if these are the first games that you want to do in the smaller scope. Probably already go overtime even with a small scope. And second of all, once you've done this a few times, only then would I suggest, once you're more comfortable with your game engine and all of that, with the entire process and how much you can work, then I would suggest maybe okay, I want to build those bigger games, go for 6 months of dev cycle at most. But I think 6 months, honestly, looking back now, isn't really the best. And then something that you often hear developers talk about as well is, hey, you need to prototype your game and you need to playtest often and all of that. The problem is, if you have that limited scope, if you have 2 or 3 months, you don't have that much time to actually have multiple like dedicated playtesting sessions, because they just cost a lot of time that you will not have. You'll notice that 3 months is still very, very short in terms of what you can actually do. My piece of advice here is not to focus on mechanics and on like game genres where you have a lot of moving parts, where they all need to come together, and until they've all come together, the game doesn't make sense. What I mean here is genres like city builders and automation games are really good examples of this. For example, Forge Industry only made sense, or like the game was only fun once we had the entire road system configured, once we had the buildings, once we had the items. All of those different pieces had to be implemented already and linked together before you could play the game. And that's a lot of code that you have to write. Same thing with city builders. You often have all of these different small mechanics that standalone maybe aren't as fun, but you're kind of just hoping that, hey, if we get all of them together, once all of them are implemented, that is when the game gets better. And sometimes this is a bit of a cope, because that is what we are having now with Guild Architect, which is the game we were working on before we like did the 1 month side tangent into Unicycle Pizza Time, where the game itself, like the mechanics we had, were standalone a bit meh, I think, and we were just pushing, like kicking the ball forward, basically assuming that, hey, once we have the tavern further implemented and all of the different areas, like all of the different expansions, then the game will get fun. But I still don't know how fun the game really is. Whereas if you have something like Unicycle Pizza Time, we had the core fun of part of the game prototyped in 2 hours, and we could just work on that. And it's much better than to just know that, hey, I'm already making a fun game, because the game is fun from day one, versus I have to just push through not knowing if this game is fun and I'll figure it out later. Don't do that. It's a mistake we have now, and we're going to go probably back to Guild Architect and see like, hey, what would we change? How would we find fun earlier? Because we can't just expect it to come magically, because if it still doesn't show up then, well, then we have a big problem, and that's not something we want. And that leads into one of the bigger problems, and that is funding. That is the thing that every single developer struggles with. And for these larger scoped games, generally the approach that like people have been saying of like, this is the industry standard, is you build a demo, you go to a publisher, and the publisher funds the rest of your game. When you apply for grants or whatever, government grants, the ones that we've done, they almost take 4 months between creating your initial document and then actually being accepted, yes or no. Same thing with publishers. You're quickly looking at multiple months of time, speaking to them, trying to get contracts, trying to get like deals done. It just takes so long, where you are basically making an entire game in the time that it takes for you to have the intro meeting with a publisher, and then maybe 3 months later get some more information about them. That is not the approach here. So the sad news, I guess, is you're most likely going to have to self-publish these kinds of games. There is going to be very little room for like investors, or Kickstarter campaigns is another one, where a Kickstarter campaign, if you want to do it well, you need to like pre-market it for a few months, and the campaign itself is like 14 or 28 days. And it just simply doesn't make sense to like have all of those funding approaches, because it's also such a small scope game. You can generally do them on your own as well. We made Unicycle Pizza Time with a total cost, excluding our hours of course, of $130. And that was basically just a $100 Steam credit, and then $30 for like the assets of our unicycle, and then some humble bundles basically for the city environment. And then we had a whole bunch of free assets from the asset store. And that was everything that we had to do, like out of pocket spending. The rest was just time on making that game. Marketing was completely free. I made a video about it over there, I don't know which side. So you can do a lot with very little money if you make these smaller scoped games, because there are smaller teams and all of that as well. So go for those first few games, make them self-published. And what we can do now is, let's say we want to make another game, we can very easily use the proceeds of that first game of Unicycle Pizza Time and just reinvest them into the next game. And that is the idea that we also have right now of like, hey, let's see if we can build on top of that. Also, very quickly, I just want to mention this because people always say it like, oh yeah, this is the sock pop approach. Like, I have a Patreon. I think something like Sock Pop does and Patreon, that is once again something that's not realistic for you to do immediately. It's something that just takes quite a bit of time to get started originally, and you need to release a whole bunch of games before you have enough of an audience that you can do things like what Sock Pop does with their Patreon in terms of earning like extra revenue on top of their game sales. So once again, most likely you're going to have to go for self-funding here. And then something else that you will probably like, huh, what does this matter? If you're a solo developer, you can kind of skip this part. But if you're making these small scoped games, I think it's better to have a smaller team than a larger one. Like when we were talking about, oh, you want to make like the big RPG or whatever, you want to have an artist, you may want to have a music person, you want to have like multiple programmers and all of that working on that same game. I think if you're going to go for that very small scope, very rapid development cycle, you're better off doing it either solo or ideally with 2 people and not more. So we're in our studio, we're 3 people. And for Unicycle Pizza Time, we only worked on it with 2 people and we worked so much faster, not because the third person was like a bad programmer and dragging us down, but because of the fact that your project management overhead just goes down so drastically. Because if I spoke to Thomas, who was my programmer, then we already were always in sync. There was never updating a third person. There was never doing any sync calls or whatever. We talked to each other and we immediately knew what we wanted to do. It's very easy to immediately understand, this is the vision I have, we're gonna work towards that vision. And also things like project management and like Kanban boards, I often say like, oh, you need a Kanban board because if you're gonna track a game for like a year of development cycle, you need to know what you're doing and you can do things like sprints. For our 1-month game, we didn't care about any of that. All we had was we just sometimes called each other when we were like, hey, I need this. And then we had one big like to-do list that just featured everything that we still needed to implement into the game, like all of the features. And that was the project management. We didn't have to lose any time on it. And once again, having that less overhead by not having to do merge requests, by not having to do all of the like sprint planning and whatnot, can actually save you so much time that you will like have a tangible benefit from in these smaller scoped games. Because if you spend the first week on design planning and getting the entire team in sync and whatever, that's already like 10% of your entire schedule that's out of the door that you're not getting back. And then the last thing that I want you to keep in mind is that you should accept that, hey, the game I'm going to make, if I want to stick to that small scope, it cannot be perfect. We're not going to make masterpieces here. Understand that. Know that your games will not be perfect and know that your games will not have everything that you would want like in an ideal world. For example, when we started with the idea of Unicycle Pizza Time, I was like, oh, we're gonna have 3 levels. And then I very quickly realized, like, my God, Marnix, you're already spending more than 1.5 weeks on making 1 level, and that's almost half the dev time. There is no way you can make 2 more levels. And there's like so many things that people will, especially after launch, also come like, why didn't you add this? Like, for example, custom characters on the Unicycle. And it's like, we thought about it, but we simply couldn't justify with the limited amount of time that we had to implement it. This is things also like, depending on the genre, controller support, fully rebindable controls, all of that. It takes more time to program, and sure, it may only be like a day for certain things, but that's still multiple % of your entire scope sometimes that you're losing on a feature that realistically may not sell the game. It may add like more to the game of like, hey, the total experience, things like achievements and whatnot, but don't like focus on making those things first and then the game second. So really just focus on that core mechanic, and as long as that is fine, don't worry about the scale. If we were to have made those 2 extra levels and we would have spent an extra like 1 month in dev time, there's no guarantee that that would have given us twice the revenue, for example. So I know maybe you're screaming at me now of like, oh, you're making slop games, Marnix, go kill yourself. And to you I have to say, we still have a positively rated game that people enjoyed because people just wanted a short, fun experience. Not everyone is out for another like 10+ hour game. Making those shorter games that have their unique hook and whatever do already work. Probably the unicycle gimmick wouldn't work for 10 hours, but it sure as hell does for 2 to 3 hours. Don't worry too much about all of that other crap that we talk about, for example, in our feature tier list of like having checkpoints, having anti-cheat. We added checkpoints after launch only because we were like, okay, enough people now need it. But once again, we didn't have the time for it during the development of the game in that shorter scope. We were like, this is not important. People just need to get better at the game. And that, once again, saved us a bunch of time that we could focus on making that core first, because it doesn't matter if that core part of the game isn't fun and it isn't there yet. I hope this is a good starter on making smaller scoped games, like going for that 3-month time period. I don't do 1 month. 1 month is so dumb, guys. I'm gonna keep saying this. What we did, do not blindly copy it. If you're interested more about, hey, how was the entire experience for us? I already talked about the marketing video. Also go and check out the video about like how much we earned. We also talk a bit more about the entire process there. And apart from that, just get started. It's like, even if you have a bad idea, At most, like I said, you'll be spending 3 months on that bad idea and you'll learn so much along the way. So that's all I really have to say. If you're interested in more videos about like game dev stuff, basically, we upload 2 videos every week on this YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe. It helps me out. It makes me happy if I see the little number go up. And apart from that, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!